local authorities to hold formal council committee meetings remotely, and those arrangements expired on 6th of May. Therefore, only those present in person can participate in the meeting. This event is also being streamed live on YouTube, and members of the public and media are welcome to watch the meeting remotely and to listen to the discussion that's taking place. To keep everyone safe, I ask all of you present to keep a face covering on when moving around the chamber and in the rest of the building. Please keep to the seating arrangements, as seating in the chamber and public gallery is limited. Now I'd like to welcome all those now in the council chamber and everybody watching on YouTube. I would like to start this evening with 72 seconds of silence to remember those who lost their lives in the Grenfell tragedy. Thank you, everybody. Before we proceed with the meeting, I would ask members of the committee only to switch on their microphones on when they are called to speak and to turn them off as soon as they've finished. Please remain seated when you're called to speak and do not stand up. If a councillor wishes to speak on a particular item and has not been called, please raise your hand to get my attention. Any members of the public who are present and have asked to speak or ask a question will be invited to come forward to the microphone on my right at the end of the top bench, and the desk and microphone will be cleaned after each speaker. I've been informed of apologies for absence from Councillor Emma Will, Councillor Portia Thaxter, who sent their apologies. Do any members have an interest to declare? Thank you, not. Minutes of the previous Select Committee meeting, minutes of the 1st of July 2021 meeting have been circulated. Does the committee agree to sign them off as correct record? Everybody happy? Thank you. So we come to the first item, Urban Forest Petition. I would like to introduce our speakers. Please note that site-specific issues out of the petition and in items 2 and 3 on the petition cannot be considered by this committee. The Council's constitution states that scrutiny committees must not scrutinise individual decisions made by the Council committees or matters related to a planning or licensing decision. For scrutiny to consider site-specific elements of this petition will be deemed to be scrutinising the decision of planning committee in relation to grant of planning for the redevelopment. So members must refrain from discussing these issues and instead focus on points 1 and 4 of the petition, Appendix A in the report, namely the proposal for an urban forest in North Kensington. The outstanding points of the petition have been responded to directly by the lead member and officers. So could I call upon Constantine Grass and Jessica Jones to introduce their petition. Welcome to you this evening. And I'm sure officers have made this clear, but it's, if you could speak or present for up to 5 minutes. And there will be a light that goes on. I think it's below me. I think it's down here, is it? Yes, right. Right. it'll go orange and then it'll go red.
Okay.
So if you could speak. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, for this opportunity to address you. I'm Jessica Jones, and I'm speaking on behalf of Warnington Trees. We're a community group campaigning to create an urban forest in North Kensington, and I believe we have some slides to show you. Where are they? Okay, this is coming out of our 5 minutes.
No, we'll give you.
Okay. Thank you. So, next slide, please. So the benefits of trees, urban trees, are myriad. We don't need to tell the Environmental Select Committee that, but next slide, please. We know that this is the wrong slide deck. We know, next slide, please. We know that they're very much needed, and that the policy and regulatory environment increasingly promotes the protection of trees and increase of trees and greening. So we hope we're pushing an open door here. But it is obvious that we need more trees. We'd like to focus in on the idea of creating an urban forest and as a pilot in Golborne Ward. Next slide, please. And we want to just look at the reasons for that. Golborne Ward is very deprived, and if you go on to the next slide, please, also has high levels of air pollution. You can see where it's positioned between the railway line, the Westway, and Ladbroke Grove. And the Marmot Review found that people who live in deprived areas actually experience more adverse health effects at the same levels of exposure to air pollution as those from less deprived areas. So it's kind of a double whammy for Golborne, and so we feel that these issues of deprivation and pollution are linked, and that's why we want to focus on Golborne Ward. Please, next slide. We also have fallout from the Grenfell disaster. Please, next slide. There is something called the London Canopy Cover Mapping Ward Prioritisation Tool, believe it or not, and in 2019 it just showed the very high need for trees in Golborne, and we can look at that in more detail when we've got time, but basically with 1 to 10, with 1 being the worst, Golborne is in the top 3 deciles, or the bottom 3, shall we say, for all these issues that affect the need for trees. Next slide, please. So we need to focus a little bit on what we've lost already in Golborne and why there is now this big need. So next slide, please. So if you look at this map, you can see that in the heart of Golborne is the Warnington Green Estate, and there are very few trees in the streets surrounding that estate. If you go forward to the next slide, you'll see why. So that's a picture of the estate as was, and you can see that it was pretty much a forest. Now, we believe that the reason that not many trees were planted in the streets was because of the density of canopy cover on the estate. Roughly 276 of those trees have now been felled. So what we really need to look at is, what are we going to do about that? We've lost so many trees in the area. So please go on to the next slide. This just shows you a map of how it was, and next slide, how it will be. So it gives you an idea of the loss that we're dealing with. Please, next slide. And this affects residents. In our opinion, from Kensal Road to the Westway, it's a forest that's been lost in the middle of Golborne. So how are we going to get that back? We can't really start from where we are now. We need to try and get that back and then improve on that. Next slide, please. That's just some of the things that locals say. Next slide, please. And that's some of the things we have to see. Next slide. We'd also want to focus on the loss of Athlone Gardens, because there are 73 trees in the park. Now, those have not been replaced at all, and of course those are trees that belong to us. Next slide, please. And not only have we lost the trees, we've lost the park. Now, we need to reinstate the trees, but we need, and increase the number of trees, but obviously we need a park to put them in. we've been without the full amenity of our park for 10 years, and the way it's going, it's looking like it could be another 10 years. So, you know, how are we going to get our park back and plant our trees to build our urban forest is a question. On we go. Right, so that's just the understanding the value of trees, and we can do that using either iTree or CAVAT, so it would be good to establish which one we're going to use. Next slide, please. But CAVAT values of trees, just to give you a bit of an idea, you know, for a reasonably sized London plane is £200,000, down to a hawthorn, which is £30,000 roughly. Next slide, please. So we just need to bust this myth that we can cut down a tree and plant a sapling. We need to increase our, you know, the planting significantly. Please, next slide. So it brings us to our proposal. We want an urban forest in North Kensington, which is more than trees.
One
minute. Okay, next slide, please. It's about planting lots of variety of trees. We want to work with the council to choose the trees, but we do insist that the trees be mature and semi-mature. We can't wait another 50 years for our trees to mature and to experience the benefits. Next slide, please. So we feel that there is a lot of space already in the streets around Warnington Green and also in Kensal, around Kensal Road, north end of Ladbroke Grove, Portobello Road. But next slide, please. We also feel that if we look at lots of different greening measures, move along, and next slide, please, and create more space by, for example, parklets, but particularly curb extensions, which also can incorporate SUDS infrastructure, which is really helpful for flooding. We can actually provide a lot more trees. Next slide.
Please, could you wind up, because you've had 5.5 minutes.
I'm winding up. It's coming. So it needs imagination in planting. Next slide. Planning. But also, there is a model for this in Lewisham. The Street Trees for Living have planted more than 1,000 trees, and their survival rate is 96%. And what we'd like to do is look at their model, rather than reinvent the wheel, bring it across here, start a pilot in Golborne, involve the community, and then once we've got that community model set up, roll it out into the surrounding wards across North Kensington, and eventually the whole borough. I hope I've managed to get something across in 5 minutes. Last slide. Thank you. That's our vision. Last slide. Thanks for your time. If you want any more info, we've got tons. Ask me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know it's a big subject, and I'm sorry to press you on the time, but I have to do that in all the agenda items, and we've got a big agenda tonight. So can I ask the lead member, Johnny, perhaps Councillor Johnny Thanathites, if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. And can I start by thanking you for the presentation, Jessica, and Constantine, for all of the campaigning you've also both done. I think it's a fantastic thing that you've brought so many people together behind this vision. And I can't imagine there are many people in the borough who don't support the aspirations that you've set out. I certainly want this to be a cleaner and greener borough and to increase the stock of trees that we have. There are some complex issues here, but at a really basic level, what I'm telling officers is that I want to plant trees wherever possible, particularly in Golborne Ward at first, but also across the borough. So I'm encouraged that we've already set about looking at surveying sites, and we've found about 100 already in the ward that we can start to look at. Hopefully lots of those will be viable in due course. If there are opportunities you think we've missed, I was particularly interested in talking about curb build-outs, for example. That's often more contentious than regular street trees because it could involve a loss of parking, for example, which can be for some residents more of an issue. But if there's support for that, then it's something I would certainly be enthusiastic about working with you on. And I think it could drastically increase the number of trees we might be able to plant because it wouldn't have the same risks in terms of coal vaults beneath the ground and so on. So I think there's a lot of really good stuff in there. I'm totally behind the aspirations. There are still complex trade-offs that will need to be resolved by members of the planning committee in terms of the phase 3 for the main application. And I don't want to prejudice that, but I know that trees are a key issue for people that do determine schemes in this borough. There are certainly evangelists for trees on the planning committee itself. I can think of at least one or two in the room. And you're fortunate too to have Councillor Mason, a very active ward councillor in Golborne, who I'm sure will work with you on all of this. He has even, it looks like he has even skipped Labour Party conference, and Brighton's loss is certainly the Chamber's gain on that front, because we have the benefit of his many decades of wisdom on the council in bringing forward as many new tree planting opportunities as possible in the ward. Just to close off, I understand that a number of questions came into us over the last 24, 48 hours or so. I've been working with officers, and officers have done a fantastic job putting together some answers which we can share offline, but I'm very happy to continue the dialogue, and I know that we have met before to go through many of the points you made in your presentation, so it's something that's certainly in my mind, and now even more so, I'm sure, that the committees too.
Thank you very much, Johnny. Pat.
Well, I'm glad to hear what Johnny has said, and as a Golborne Ward Councillor, you won't be surprised to hear that, of course, I completely support producing, having an urban forest to replace the urban forest that was chopped down, which was an abomination 10 years ago, when the whole estate was opposed to the entire planning application, not because they didn't want housing, as we were told then, that we didn't want people to have housing, but because of environmental issues, affluent gardens, the trees, those others as well. The historical members of this council allowed that to happen when they had an absolute forest of people against it at the time. So I'm still angry 11 years later because we are just simply quoted that the application was approved 11 years ago, and therefore will make all kinds of symbolic noises, as has been made at the OSC and various committees, but actually we can't legally stop Catalyst from chopping down those forest of trees which they have and are doing, which is why it's so important in the local plan in particular that we put cast iron legal commitment into the local plan that this actually can't happen, because you see, no matter what Johnny says, and he did talk about aspirations, he won't be here forever. I've been a councillor for 30 years, and I've seen what happens when different administrations change and different cabinet members change, as they used to be called, and lead members change. And Johnny is one of those people who believes in what you're talking about. But the next lead member may have different priorities, and unless this is put into cast iron law, as it were, as far as we can do it, then these very clever lawyers and planning experts will wind the committees round they will put the committees into catch-22 situations, because government planning law, as you know, is written with so many holes that would drop sieves of water through. Of course this should happen, but we have lost many more trees than just the trees on Warrington Green over the last 30 years. There's been all kinds of other plots of trees and environmental spaces. There was huge battles over the last 30 years to keep and maintain other green spaces and to create green spaces. I think I managed to only, in 30 years, create 2 new green spaces, one of them in Golborne Ward on the Swinbrook Estate, on a little area that's now fenced off. And if the then historical council had their way, we'd have had £800,000 flats sitting on the factory site in Meanwhile Gardens, even although the council said at that time, and it was council policy, not to do such a thing. So when the conflict comes between environment, trees, and developers, and them quoting the law, the councils, not just this council, but councils will cave in, because if they don't, the developer will go to the planning inspectorate or take them to court, whatever the process is, and councils, especially these days after 10 years of austerity, are terrified of the huge bills and the precedent it sets. So the commitment is made, but it's going to take a long time, and unless, Mr. Chairman, we especially the local plan. I mean, I see the local plan talking about trees, but it's all...
Pat, we're going to be talking about the
I know
local
that,
plan
but
next.
I'm just saying, I don't know if you're staying for the local plan discussion, but of course I support this, but making it happen is going to be quite a different thing, because the cabinet member, the lead member as he is now, of course, is supportive, but even he is talking about the conflicts that there will be. But you have to come down on the side of the community. If 600 people, as happened in 2010, were opposed to a planning application, and they say now, and they've said now that it would never be passed now, then it must, as they said, never happen again, because we've got to get to climate change emergency zero in just a few years' time. I mean, we can't have any of that happening. We can't have any trees or any ecosystems or any green space of any description ceded to developers for whatever reason. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Deputy Chairman Miles Connor.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Jessica, for your excellent presentation. I couldn't agree more with so much of what you say, and also with Johnny and a lot of what Pat says as well. And Johnny's been very good as lead member supporting the introduction and the planting of more trees. But I think a point that we all have to recognise is that planting saplings really is, as you say, no replacement for the enormous trees that are cut down daily all over the borough. And the scandal seems to me that I see the weekly planning application breakdown document that's sent out to councillors, and this week I looked and there were 27 applications to cut down mature trees in the borough, and officers' response is, in my view, not nearly robust enough, and constantly we were told unless there's a TPO on the tree, a tree preservation order on the tree, that there's nothing we can do at all. And so mature trees are cut down daily and replaced with absolutely nothing, and on occasion they're replaced with small saplings, and people say that those are replacements. And then there are problems of their own with replacing them with mature and semi-mature trees, which are expensive and environmentally not very friendly to import on big lorries and then dump in the ground. So it's a real problem, and the problem, as I see it, is allowing the trees to be cut down in the first place. And I don't want to get onto the specifics of Wellington Grange, but I completely agree with so much of what you've said. Thank you very much.
Can I ask, are any other members of the committee who'd like to speak? Are there any other councillors in the room? Or are there any other members of the public who'd like to speak on this matter? Right. Then if we could come back to Constantine and Jessica, if you'd like to make a final remark or two for a couple of 2 minutes, please. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So trees are central to the urban forest, but it must include a diversity of green infrastructure measures. So, you know, we ask, how can the council better coordinate across departments to join up efforts to plant trees with other efforts in planting, encouraging biodiversity, minimising traffic, reducing air pollution, reducing private car use, mitigating flooding, promoting active travel and community cohesion, all of which is enhanced by the urban forest. So this is a cross-council thing, you know, and we need you to start working together in different departments. We also would like you to start working with us, and you know what we ask is, how can we best work with you for the good of all to make this happen? Because we are really clear that community involvement in this will not only create the opportunity to plant more trees, but it will help more of them to survive, because when the trees are cared for and looked after and, you know, people have ownership of them, then, as we've seen in Lewisham, they have a 96% survival rate of the trees that they've planted, which is incredibly high. I think most boroughs have between 50 and 70%. And, you know, what's the point of planting trees and then just watching them die? You know, we want to involve schools, involve individuals, involve businesses in you know, this is an opportunity not just for planting more trees, but for education, for improving food supply, allotments, fruit trees. You know, there's a whole diversity of planting that can take place here, but obviously it cuts across different departments. And so, you know, an urban forest is a big thing, but I sort of feel if we can get it right here in Golborne, we can then replicate it quite easily across the borough.
Okay. Thank you very much. If I could then try to sum up, the situation is that I think I would speak on behalf of the committee members here in supporting the principle of growing more trees, as has been outlined by the lead member as well. So I think we're all at one on that. I think something that's not come up perhaps clearly enough in the discussion so far is that there are considerable constraints from a purely physical point of view under the pavements and even under the roads due to services, a multiplicity of them. We've all seen in the last few months the number of road closures and inconvenience of the fibre optics being put around the borough, and it illustrates how complex the services are, because that's probably the smallest service under the pavement, and there are many, many more. In some places there are 40-inch or 60-inch gas mains going through the borough, at the other end of the scale, plus all the drains and so on. So there are limitations on the physicality. There are limitations on resources as well, to be realistic, physical and officers and money. But I think the sentiment of getting the different departments in the borough to work together, and together with the local residents identifying potential places to put trees. And I think it would be useful if officers were to give us sort of straight, you know, basic guide as to what might work and what might not work in terms of, because otherwise you'll just get hundreds of suggestions that are not worth looking at. So to refine that a bit, I think that would enable better working together. I think that there are council plans to take Pat's point, you know, institutionalising in the council plan, in the local plan, which is going through a redo at the moment. The consultation is out on options, as we're going to be talking about in a minute. And please, anybody who's interested in the subject, get your views, including on trees, into that consultation, because it will be written more forcefully into that plan as it's drafted later on this year. And then we have the green plan and various other more detailed plans. I think that the idea of working with a pilot is an excellent one. Sometimes when things are a bit untested, it's proven very useful as a mechanism within the borough to work on a pilot, learn the lessons before rolling it out. I hope it goes further across the borough. There are other parts of the borough which are very deprived. Finally, I'd like to suggest you have a quick look at the thing that's just been launched called the Queen's Green Canopy, which is all to do with the Jubilee. There are 3 million trees available, first come, first serve, for bids. So if you want some for a pilot in Golborne, I would get applying soon. Because I understand from a school that I'm involved in that they've actually got 30 today. They applied and they were confirmed pretty quickly, so it's worth having a bid. They're not going to be available in the spring. They're going to be available from now, so it's worth having a look at. So what I would suggest is to a committee, with your agreement, that we ask James to draft us a recommendation along the lines I've spoken, perhaps a little bit shorter than I've spoken, to support the idea of a pilot in Golborne for urban forest, involving residents and pilot and officers, and that we look forward to that being pursued.
Can I just, before we wrap on this item, we've obviously done the survey and found these 100 sites, but if there are curb build-outs you want us to consider, then you talked about how can we work with the council, how can the community work with the council? Tell us where you think might work, and I'm happy to explore it. Obviously, all of those sites will need consultation in due course, but I'm certainly open to the principle of that, and I see that as an opportunity to increase the number of trees. I think the other important point that's been raised is about Pat, I think you used the word kind of enshrining it in law, and Charlie, you've talked about policy. If particularly either of you want meetings with me and with officers to talk about our tree policies in the local plan, then now's a great time to do it. I want them to be as robust as possible, and I won't get everything right myself. So if you think you can help me strengthen it, then I'm happy to work with you on that. So the offer's open to members on the policy side and to residents on specific locations if we can keep working on that together.
Mr. Chair, what I meant was we need to be able to be in a position where, for example, a planning committee, or officers even before it goes to the planning committee, are able to resist at the beginning the cutting down of trees, and for example, just to use the Warrington Green example, that they would design the development around the trees, which didn't happen at Warrington Green. So we need to be in a position in a local plan or other law where we can actually say to them, we will do this, and we know that we will be able to win an appeal against them saying, no, it's going to cost us too much to do that, etc.
Right, a good point well made, and I would urge you to make that point on the website in relation to the consultation on the local plan, because there is a whole section on biodiversity and the environment. So, okay, thank you. Right, thank you very much indeed for you coming tonight. We now need to move on to item A5, which is the new local plan review, issues and options consultation. Members will be aware that the Council has been reviewing its local plan, which is a key planning policy document. Last year, the Council consulted on the issue new local plan review had to address. This year, the Council has also been consulting on the options as part of the new local plan review. The new local plan review issues and options consultation started in July and will end on Monday, the 4th of October, which is next Monday. So I urge all of you who have issues that you wish to comment on, not only tonight, but you put them into the website so they'll be fully taken into account. In addition, I've also requested that the paper by Andrew Boff, on behalf of a number of, in relation to his committee and the GLA, but also in relation to a number of professional institutions and bodies and a couple of local councils in London that have experience with regard to some aspects of the London plan. And then the other point to make at this stage is to say that the Secretary of State has now changed to Michael Gove, who one of his earliest actions was to pause the white paper in relation to planning. So both Boff's paper raises questions. That's been circulated as part of the papers tonight, and members, I assume, have read that and can use it as part of their questioning. And I think also that we need to make sure that when the Secretary of State has made it clear as to what his intention is with regard to the white paper, that is incorporated in the drafting process for the local plan. Because whilst I understand the London plan has been adopted, no doubt there will be some adjustment to the London plan if the Secretary of State decides to make a national shift in terms of policy. So I think that all I'm saying is that both those papers address issues which will need further investigation following today. So first of all, I'd like to call on Councillor Thanasitis to speak and introduce the paper. Johnny.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I start by paying tribute to the planning officers who have worked on the local plan issues and options paper, because I think they've done a really fantastic job, and you can see that it's an incredibly detailed piece of work. So we've got a few officers here tonight, and actually also the officers that helped on the previous paper too. The local plan is obviously, it's basically the Bible in terms of planning policy in the borough. And we should treat it as sacrosanct as that in as many ways as we can. There's a lot in here, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. We are still in listening mode, really. This is currently a consultation paper. We will be reflecting on everything that we hear in terms of responses that we get. There are some really difficult trade-offs, particularly around well, building heights and housing numbers and things like that, which I can see Andrew Boff's paper also deals with, so we welcome views on those sorts of subjects. But no, I'm more interested in hearing what you think at this stage. I think there's a hell of a lot to work through, and I'm sure you've all spent a lot of time reading it.
Thank you, Johnny. Now, as members will be aware, having read the paper, this is a massive tome. So I asked James Diamond, who's supporting us, to prepare a paper which has been circulated to you, which is basically the Select Committee objectives and lines of inquiry paper. And in that, we have, first of all, reiterated the 4 objectives that we have in this area as Select Committee, and for the benefit of those present who haven't seen this paper. We evaluate how the draft local plan relates to the London plan, planning white paper, and emerging COP26 policy. Number 2, scrutinise to what extent the new local plan review reflects the wishes of the borough residents and is aligned to the recent update of our council plan 2019 to 2023. Thirdly, scrutinise alignment of RBKC policies, including carbon net zero 2040, biodiversity, trees, community gardens. 4, evaluate how the new local plan review balances housing delivery, density and height, conservation areas and sustainable communities. So what we then decided was to prioritise 3 chapters, because not all of the local plan has been changed or is proposed to be changed, and not all of the local plan are in areas that have a main impact on the items in our priorities in terms of scrutiny. So we've decided that the 3 chapters, number 6, 7 and 13, which are green, blue, future, homes and conservation and design, particularly in relation to density and height. And if one is going to succeed in all 3 of these areas, there are potential conflicts of resources and physicalities. And therefore, the policies here need to be carefully worked through to make sure that the right balance is addressed. So if we could start on chapter 6, Green, Blue, Future. The issues that come forward are particularly climate change, building design, air quality, noise, vibration, flood risk, biodiversity, green infrastructure, waste management. So one of the things I'd like to note here is that planning, which is what we're talking about here, the local plan controls the planning policy, or sets the tone, or whatever is the major weighted document for planning policy. Planning policy only applies either to new builds or to refurbishments that require planning, and there are trips as to what that means. And therefore, by 2040, only 10 to 20% of the stock in the borough will be affected by the local plan. That's not diminishing the importance of it, but what it does emphasise is that if planning permissions from now onwards do not achieve carbon net zero, or show how that can be achieved by 2040, the new stock or refurbished stock being introduced into the mix will not contribute to the target of the 2040 achievement. It's going to be hard enough to bring the rest of the stock, the remaining 80 to 90% up to scratch by 2040. But if we don't actually start with the ones which are affected by the local plan and those things that are being done now, there's probably little chance of doing it, because it's at the major changing points of a building's life, either new or when it's undergoing refurbishment or major maintenance, that these things can happen. So I'd like to ask members if they could ask questions in relation to Chapter 6 to start off with. So who would like to go first? Councillor Wall-Edris.
Thank you, Chair. You actually hit the point that even when sitting on planning committees, I found to be very bizarre, that a lot of buildings and planning permissions are actually permitted without specifying that putting new boilers need to be green boilers. And there is, for some reason, there is a loophole where you can build a new building, yet use an old style boiler when we are trying to achieve carbon net zero by 2030. So that, to me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and I was hoping someone from the planning committee can explain it to me. Thank you.
Well, maybe I could put that in a context of the Green Plan. In the
Yes.
Green Plan, it actually makes this objective quite clear and states that the strategy should be fabric first, then the boilers, as you mentioned, and then if that can't be achieved, there should be some form of tariff, and maybe we could return to the tariff issue later on. But maybe it's useful if we ask officers that particular question as to how the Green Plan and the objective 2040 will be built into planning decisions and conditions as of now forward with the local plan.
And can they explain to me how green is the tariff? Because I don't, I mean,
Yep.
yeah, thank you.
Okay?
Start. I think the straightforward answer is that the loophole you described isn't really a loophole. There's no such thing as development that contains 100% social housing, that is totally net zero, that radically increases the stock of trees, is low-rise and classically built. I mean, every planning decision is a set of trade-offs, and there's a planning balance. And so we need to determine things in the round. It's not as straightforward as saying, you know, we will not approve it if it doesn't meet X criteria. So we always need to balance the benefits and harms. What the local plan will do, and hopefully does, and what I'm seeking for it to do, is to have a clear approach that promotes the greenest possible buildings, and then we hope the developers will heed that, and insofar as they can, deliver on those commitments. But we also need to be pragmatic about development. There will, you will never have a perfect scheme, so all we can do is set a policy framework that is robust enough to allow to encourage very green development, but also flexible enough to adapt to circumstance, and to say that sometimes it will be a balance, and then committee members will be much more well-versed than I am in how we can best make that determination in each individual case. Is there anything you want to...
I think it's still an area that technology is still to a degree catching up with the aspirations. And clearly in the past, there hasn't always been the technology available to actually really always make developments as viable, which they have to be delivered. So I think that's changing. We do have now a policy which basically will require all major development to be net zero carbon. I think the challenge is how do you actually achieve that in practice? And the issue is basically, previously, there's an energy hierarchy, and we would try and want to achieve that as much as possible on site. For the reasons that Councillor Thalasitis has just mentioned, that is very challenging to do. So often part of it is achieved on site, but part of it is taken in terms of a carbon contribution, which is ring-fenced and spent elsewhere in the borough as a sort of offset fund. I think moving forward, we want to make sure that we achieve higher percentage of carbon zero on site, but there's got to be credible and viable alternatives. And we are getting there, but I don't think we're necessarily there yet. So you're right about gas boilers. They will be replaced, and we're looking at ground source heat pumps and air source heat pumps. But they are challenging to introduce, particularly in areas like historic townscape and for new builds. So I think it's a challenge for the council. I think the policy will be there to do it, and I think the policy that we'll be setting will be in the vanguard of achieving net zero on site. But there will still always be, I think, a trade-off to a degree about how much we can achieve on site and how much we can achieve through a contribution. But I think the policy will be robust from that point of view.
Can I also say, I hope none of this is interpreted as a diminution of our commitment to greening the borough. We can see from the vision section of the issues and options paper that right at the heart of that vision are the issues of affordability, greening, and high-quality designs. So we have set out a stall that puts environmentally friendly development right at the top of the pile, really. And that will continue to be our ambition, I hope. So whilst we're articulating some of the trade-offs and the balance that committees will have to make a judgment about, we are clear that getting to net zero is a serious ambition, and we do hope we get there.
Sorry,
Paula, do you want to just
supplementary question,
quickly, because we've got other people on to speak?
Yeah, but isn't boilers are the biggest villains when it comes to emitting carbon and pollution? So you would think the biggest villain will be one of the things that we will actually be very strict about. And then compromise and offset on the other stuff.
Policy will be very clear that we support net zero buildings, and that's at the heart of the local plan. It will be for committees to determine in each individual case how to apply those policies. They will have policy justification through the local plan to reject buildings should they wish, if they're insufficiently green. It's only really to say that it can't be determined in a binary way in any of these scenarios.
Okay, Maxwell, next.
Thank you, Chair. Part of the greening of the borough, I think, are also people's private gardens. And I always worry when I sit on planning and people are applying for an outbuilding, that as soon as that comes in, or that they want to extend outwards, you're never going to get that back. You never see anyone who wants to knock down their outbuilding and build a garden. It pretty much just never happens. So for me, in terms of a takeaway, if we can try and make it, if gardens are a certain size too small, that you shouldn't allow for extensions, and certainly we should be more resistant to outbuildings, because I say once that land is built over, it's gone. It's gone. You won't have that as a garden anymore. That's my takeaway on this section.
Charles?
Thank you very much. I agree with what Maxwell has just said, and I was going to say I'm sorry to bang on about it, but actually I make no apology for banging on about trees, which is the point I come back to. And in the blue boxes in Chapter 6, we've got Issue 4, flood risk, Issue 5, biodiversity, and Issue 6, green infrastructure. And in each of those boxes that helpfully summarises what residents have told us, it says that trees are a major issue, and the only one where we actually respond to those is in Issue 6, in green infrastructure. That's the only one where trees are actually mentioned, despite them being raised in Issues 4, 5 and 6. And under 6 it says the Council's current policy is generally to resist the loss of trees, and there is a presumption towards retention backed up by appropriate protection. But I've been told this time and again. It then goes on to say, we are satisfied that CR6 provides the appropriate protection for trees. Well, I'm not. We are allowing, as I've said already this evening, I suspect we're allowing the loss of 21 trees that are not protected by a TPO just this week alone, and there is no way that we're planting anything like the replacements for those 21 trees, whether saplings or full-size trees. And so it strikes me we are presiding over a massive net loss of trees in the borough, and it really is a scandal, and I just don't think we are addressing it sufficiently in this new local plan. Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree with Councillor O'Connor. I've been around long enough for the Council to have produced many environment plans which included the retention of trees. And I remember once on the off Acklam Road, the Council was going to allow 10 trees to be chopped down, mature trees on a development. And I had to rush 2 days before the development was to start and managed, amazingly, to get the council to agree TPOs on the trees, and I stuck the notices on myself. But the council's historically had a policy of retaining trees and planting trees, etc., etc. But of course, planning application after application after application, trees came down. We used to, as you say, we used to be notified nearly every week of where trees were being knocked down. There'd always be an excuse for this. Sometimes it was disease, and sometimes it was just a developer's right to do it. So throughout this plan, and I've seen many of these plans, and I've sat on working parties dealing with the core strategy and others, I agree, of course, with all developments should be air quality neutral. We've declared a climate emergency, and we've seen what that actually should mean in practice for the residents and the council. It's pretty stringent if we're going to get to that line. But these plans have got all these playoffs. Residents, we can clearly see what residents want here and throughout the local plan review. They want us to retain, they want us to increase tree planting, they want us to reduce air quality, they want us to improve air quality, etc. Because, like myself, I'm asthmatic, and when it was hot just 2 weeks ago, I was flattened for 3 days with the state of the air when everybody else was apparently sitting enjoying it. So that's a real problem. But it's how do you actually write a plan that, as far as possible, implements what the plan actually says. I mean, we've got pages of options here, and I agree with all of it. But how are we going to actually make it work? How are we going to actually make it work at the coalface, at the planning committee, at the licensing committee, at the whatever committee? How are we going to make it work in practice so that we get to 2030 net carbon zero, that we have better air quality, that we have all the things that we said in here? I mean, for example, it says here that adding insulation or replacing old windows may help reduce emissions, but may also change the appearance of the building, and that it goes against conservation policy, for example. And I've been around long enough to have sat on environment committees where there was a huge rush on to create conservation areas because it meant you couldn't change anything. Nothing could be changed. Certain communities in this borough didn't want anything to change. They resisted any change, and that included environmental change and, and so on. So we need to write a plan that doesn't have the maybes, the caveats, and these plans have been full of those, and the officers know pretty well. They've got to translate this into practice, and the reality is they probably can't in this form. We need to be tougher. We need to take what residents say and put it into practice in my own ward with various with Warrington Green College, with the North Kensington Library, with all these different issues where the council effectively went with the side of the developer or decided to do something. They were able to do the impossible when they were confronted with huge campaigns by residents. We must have a can-do approach, and I hear far too much over the last 30 years, apart from you, Johnny. We have far too much pessimism, far too much, well, we shouldn't, we can't do this. We're far too cautious. You know what? That gets to the offices of the developers and the consultants. They know this. They know. They use this in the committees against us. They know committees have been briefed that they are going to approve something, even though the objectors don't like it, don't want it. So we need to be much more can-do and much more a much stronger voice. We need to have a much tougher plan. This is a good plan, but it has so many holes in it that they will ride roughshod over us, as they've been doing for the last 30 years.
That's actually, you made a very good point there, because I don't know whether this is what exactly you meant, but I think that there are so many objectives set in this plan that if we pursued all of them to the extent that residents want them to be pursued, they'd be completely unreconcilable. And the difficulty is in trying to balance up some of these things.
Can I ask then, can I set a challenge to the committee? Which of the commitments contained in the current draft of the local plan would you most like us to drop?
Yes, well, we're on the first chapter at the moment, so we'll come to that issue, I think, when we get further down the agenda. It's a very good point that you're making, and you'd like some feedback, and I would. The other thing that I'd like to contribute at this stage is just a small point, is that my assessment at this enormous chapter is that one of the most difficult examples is addressing the need to improve the thermal quality of glazing in conservation area buildings. because the classical and straight position on conservation areas is that you can't change anything. But unless we go for double glazing or whatever in conservation areas in a way that doesn't harm those buildings, we will never be able to address the thermal characteristics that are required by carbon zero. And another edge to this discussion as well is that whilst we have to be realistic in balancing the various objectives, the Council has not made it an objective to try to get to carbon zero and 2030 for its own operations and 2040 for the whole borough. It's made it a commitment, and there's a very big difference. This chamber, and I was the only councillor not to vote on it because I was sitting in this chair as mayor and chairing the meeting, this chamber voted for a full undiluted commitment to achieve carbon net zero by 2030 for its own operations and for the borough for 2040. Now that does actually make for some very difficult decisions in terms of policy development, both by officers and by lead members. I think the sort of realistic step at a time and far as we can go doesn't live up to that commitment, which is, I understand, in legal terms, a higher decision making than anybody who's here present. So that is a difficulty which is going to have to be addressed by all organs of the council in future. If I could also ask that we now move to asking the Paul Lever from the Chelsea Society, if you'd like, you kindly come tonight, and if you could come and speak for up to 5 minutes, and the table is over here to the right. Thank you very much, Paul, for coming tonight, and I understand that you not only are speaking on behalf of the Chelsea Society, but there have been quite a few other societies who've made inputs to you because they were unable to come tonight to speak. So thank you for representing everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm speaking on behalf of the Chelsea Society. There's much in this document that we welcome, but I'd like to make 4 general points about it. First, the context. These are uncertain times. Things are changing a lot. Retail patterns of shopping are changing. Work habits are changing. Transport requirements are changing. Housing requirements also. It's not an ideal time to write a new local plan, but if there is to be a new one, we would urge you to retain in it enough flexibility so that you don't set in stone policies which in a couple of years turn out to be based on assumptions which turned out not to be valid. Second, conservation and heritage. Most of Chelsea is in a conservation area, and for the Chelsea Society, maintaining the character and indeed enhancing the character of these conservation areas should be a key priority. We don't think that this is given enough attention in the document. It has implications for policies, for example, on tall buildings. Chelsea has a range of architectural styles, but they're all low-rise. Our section of the Thames waterfront is unique in that, with the sad exception of Chelsea Harbour, it is unscathed by tall buildings. We want to keep Chelsea this way. We don't want our streets canyonized. We don't want the character of our area altered. We don't want the views and the vistas to be damaged. We were therefore dismayed to see in paragraph 13.8 of the document what seems to be an attempt to somehow revise the definition of tall buildings in order to loosen the present restrictions on them. We would urge the Council not to go down this route. There are other reasons for being very doubtful about tall buildings in relation to community housing. I think the BOF paper sets them out extremely well. Third, on housing more generally, there's a consistent theme throughout the document that more housing is needed. Indeed, it seems to be almost the driving factor of the whole paper. But housing is treated as though it's a single commodity. It isn't. There's a huge difference between luxury apartments acquired as a store of value by absentee overseas landlords and places where key workers can actually live. There's no point in just having arbitrary quotas which don't reflect the nature of the units of accommodation which are being generated. And from our society's point of view, we don't doubt there is a need for more housing, but we would not see it, as far as Chelsea is concerned, as the one key priority. Preserving jobs and generating new jobs and ensuring the well-being of the people, the residents who live in Chelsea, would be higher priorities as far as we're concerned. Chelsea is already part of the most densely populated borough in London. We don't have a shortage of housing. We have a shortage of affordable housing. And the council needs to be far more attentive to the requirements to ensure that such new housing as is built in the coming years is the sort of housing that we want, and not simply the sort of housing that developers find it profitable to build. And this brings me on to the fourth point, which is realism. The document has a very ambitious tone to it, and we wonder whether it doesn't in places exaggerate the council's ability itself to deliver some of the changes which are advocated. Most investments are made by the private sector, whether it's the things that appear in our high streets or the buildings, the type of accommodation that gets built. The council can influence this a bit through planning policies, but mostly to stop things happening rather than to ensure that specific things do happen. The 35% rule on affordable housing, for instance, the rule that 35% of all developments above a certain size have to be affordable housing. We very much welcome it, but we notice that developers can in most cases find a way of somehow wriggling out of it or mitigating its effect. Unless something can be done about that, and whether this means a change in the law or a change in the definitions, we don't know. But we would counsel against setting out policies which in practice are not really going to be deliverable, or where the council doesn't yet know how it's going to deliver them. So our final plea to you on this document would be, this is a beautiful borough, and we like to think that Chelsea is the most beautiful part of it. It has a fantastic architectural heritage. It has a special character. Your job, we would suggest, is to ensure that this survives intact into the future. Please don't let yourselves be bullied by the Mayor of London or by central government into spoiling it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I respond to some of those points? Can I start by thanking you, Sir Paul, for your contribution tonight? I think on the vast majority of things that you've said that there is no difference between our positions. And hopefully as we set about drafting policies for the new local plan over the winter, we can reduce the appearance of any difference too. I entirely agree that we should focus on preserving the fantastic amenity and the quality of our townscape in Chelsea. I'm very clear, particularly you referenced the waterfront. I do not think that Chelsea Riverside is a suitable place for very tall buildings. I would not support towers anywhere in that part of the borough, or indeed anywhere in Chelsea. I think we are very fortunate to have largely a low-rise community. I draw your attention to, in the context of trying not to make housing our single lodestar, a commitment in the Green-Blue chapter to a new Riverside Park in Chelsea, which I think is an exciting opportunity to deliver on something that historically there's been a deficit of, that being open space. It's something that I'm personally very keen that we make sure is delivered if it possibly can be. And I would encourage members of the Chelsea Society to note their support for that element of the Issues and Options paper. I'd like to think that some of the points you've raised are addressed, although perhaps we need to change the emphasis in this paper. You talked about, I think rightly, affordable housing being the real crisis, not housing in the round. And that's why the first point in the vision of the Issues and Options paper is around the affordability of housing. Likewise, the third plank of that vision is intended to communicate our seriousness about preserving the quality of the townscape and the high quality design that we are used to. But I think you may be right that we could draw that out further, and I'm happy to look into that. But generally, I think our visions for Chelsea, yours and the council's, are very similar. I think we want to continue for this to be the most beautiful place in the country to live. We certainly recognise it as such. Wherever possible, we want to enhance existing amenity. I would like to see the employment zone, for example, in Chelsea enhanced. As I said, I'd like to see more green space. And I don't anticipate us being bullied around by anybody, let alone the Mayor of London, who we have happily jousted with over the last few years on many applications, mostly in Kensington, so it's probably a relief for your members that you haven't had to take up the cudgels in quite the same way, but should we need to, we will certainly stand there with you and fight the case, fight the cause. And hopefully that is some reassurance on what I anticipate is likely to be your submission to the consultation.
Right. Thank you, Johnny, very much indeed. Thank you, Paul. Michael Bach from the Kensington Society, perhaps you'd like to come and speak for up to 5 minutes. Whilst Michael's coming up, one thing I missed out of the discussion on Chapter 6 was that I think it would be useful for officers to have a look at the proposition that tariff is not done as a one-off exercise, but whilst the building does not achieve carbon zero, it should pay a tariff every year. And that should then encourage, because then they haven't got off the hook, that they're on the hook until they sort the problem out. But at the same time, that the money they pay into the pot should be available to come back to help them put the thing right. So, you know, if they get on with it, they'll have less tariff to pay in the future. So there'll be much more incentive, rather than building into the developer and sell on at the time of development. Anybody buying or occupying or leasing or whatever that building will know that they will have a penalty to pay until they've hit the target. So I think it'd be a useful one for officers to have a look at. The mechanics of that might be difficult, and even the legalities of it, but I think it's a proposition to keep the pressure on rather than just letting them off the hook after once. So Michael Bach from the Chelsea Society, I hope that Amanda Frame is well, and I'm sad that she's not able to accompany you tonight, but please speak for up to 5 minutes.
Chair, you're allowed to be confused because I'm also a member of the Chelsea Society.
Right.
But I'm the Kensington Society.
Yes, sorry if I confused the two.
First of all, sorry?
So please go ahead, yes.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say we support a lot of what the Chelsea Society has said. The same issues affect us, especially in conservation and housing. But we've taken a rather broader approach about the strategy, and whilst we consider that there's plenty of good stuff in this document, our critique is of the strategy. Now, as you know, our development plan is under review. The consultation is 147 pages, if you haven't started yet, and the consultation ends next Tuesday. The planners are really in the middle of reviewing our local plan because it has to be updated for some of our policies. We also need to incorporate the 2021 London plan and reflect the government policies in the latest version of the National Planning Policy Framework, and also to fulfil the promise made to Grenfell residents, which was the reason the last plan got approved by the Secretary of State. But as we all know, most likely as a result of major opposition to the government's white paper, there's been a change of ministers, as well as an indication that not all of the proposals in the white paper will be in the final package. The thing to remember is the white paper is not the policy. It's not been approved. It should not and cannot direct us in our own review. It's work in progress. It's the Kensington Society's position that we should take the National Planning Policy Framework direction, which requires us to contribute towards sustainable development, addressing social progress, economic well-being, and environmental protection. But what it must do, it must plan positively in a way that's both aspirational as well as deliverable. We focused on that strategy, and particularly the development strategy. The Kensington Society is worried about the direction the planners have taken the new local plan review, which would fail to meet some of these criteria. Putting it bluntly, the strategy as presented is not sustainable, it's not sufficiently aspirational, and most importantly, it's not deliverable. And I'm talking about particularly the effort that's being put into meet numbers that have been put forward by the government, which I should think needs another round of action. More particularly, we're concerned about the scale of development proposed, which is unachievable and unbalanced. The type of development that we've seen in two recent planning approvals is for exaggerated densities to be achieved through tall buildings. The control of where and how these tall buildings will be built is being eroded by the process of how they should be identified. We're also concerned about the environmental damage and the community harm that will be detrimental. The emphasis on tall buildings would be unsustainable. Andrew Buff has highlighted this, but recent research goes even further, which looks at the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, which for tall buildings is 140% greater than medium-rise high-density building. The environment requirement is to meet the 2030 and 2050 targets. It's impossible with this density and this height. It will also not create sustainable communities. You only have to look at Warwick Road. If that's the future, I'm sure you wouldn't want it. The strategy follows the white paper housing numbers. This is too complicated to go into here, although I'm happy to answer questions. The only way that this numbers could be supported by the planners would require serious changes to our townscape. The protection that we have will no longer be there. Think of whole terraces that would go and replaced with tower blocks. That's the only way you would get large numbers and an increase in density. Think of canyons of tall buildings with no green open spaces. Again, Warwick Road is an example, only these would be bigger. The strategy proposed by the planners needs to be adjusted and can be on the lines directed by the MPPF, aspirational and focus more on sustainable development, identifying whether and if so where tall buildings might be suitable, with the onus of proof being on whether it would be sustainable and support communities. Greater emphasis on zero carbon when deciding whether to demolish and reuse buildings. Again, it's considering the full life cycle of greenhouse gas emissions. And the focus for new housing must be on objectively assessed need, as well as especially building and retaining.
We've gone beyond 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm nearly finished. Our town centres and local centres need to be strengthened. What we want is a local plan to direct us in creating the types of places that residents want and are comfortable with. I would remind you of what our council plan says. We're committed to putting local people at the heart of decision-making process, and that's what we expect from the local plan. These are only a few of the issues. There are others, but this is not the time or forum to present them. The Council did promise this review. However, no one knew that the white paper was coming, and no one knows what direction it will finally take. We must produce a new local plan. Let's use the MPPF direction and not be misdirected by the poorly thought out things. And I'm not talking about the council's poorly thought out, I'm talking about the government's and the extremely damaging government schemes. The bottom line is, what is our vision? What kind of place do we want? Can we have a place that we're proud of and that we're comfortable with in 20 years' time? And the real question is, how do we deliver that? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Great. Johnny, do you like to have a...
Yeah, I'll be brief because I don't want to dominate discussion this evening, but can I start by thanking you, Michael, for your speech tonight, and also for the work that you and the Kensington Society, and indeed with your Chelsea Society hat on, do for the borough. I think in a lot of ways you keep us honest, you keep our feet to the proverbial, and try your best to make sure that we deliver growth in a way that is sensitive to the surrounding context. I think what you've said tonight very correctly identifies a lot of the trade-offs that we're grappling with. There's clearly, as you say, a lot of uncertainty around the white paper in particular, and we will need to adapt our policies and our vision on the basis of what comes forward. I know there have been some differences of opinion between members of the community and members of the planning committee on one or two applications lately, but I'm totally confident that the planning committee shares your goal that amenity in Kensington should be preserved, that this should be a broadly low-rise borough, and that wherever possible we should seek to deliver beautiful buildings. I have no doubt that we have a team here that wants to deliver that, and I look forward to trying to make sure that our local plan, as far as possible, gives us the tools to achieve this.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael, very much indeed. Gentlemen and ladies, could we return to the chapters in the report? I think that we've talked a lot about the environment and about the housing targets set by the London plan. I think it might be useful to have a look at chapter 13 and to ask for anybody who's got any questions about how we might have a view about reconciling some of the conflicting requirements as in the chapters prior, 6 and 7 that we've discussed. So would anybody like to raise an issue under 13? Voila.
In chapter 13, I was thinking about tall buildings, and in some areas there is a limit on how high buildings can be. Is that something we can consider? Having a maximum height for buildings in certain areas? This way, developers, when they come to us, they know offhand that they cannot go beyond, say, I don't know, 10 meters, 12 meters, whatever it is.
I think partly that's discussed under the definition of tall buildings in other parts of the paper, but I think one of the things that might go with that, to add to that question, would be one of what's the occupant who's going to go into the accommodation in the tall building, because it's very interesting, it isn't a one-size-fits-all. If you have a family, particularly if there are any disabled children or vulnerable adults.
Or just have 4 children.
It's very difficult to make that work if they are a long distance, not only from the ground, but also from the amenities which are mentioned under Chapter 10, in the local community facilities and so on. If you have young single or childless professionals, either in the social sector or even on the private sector, provided the buildings are well managed and the lifts work. If they've got a long working day and they go to other places to do their shopping and their non-work activities, etc., then sometimes the high-rise buildings units can sell at a premium or be highly desirable. So it does depend. So if the objective is to provide more affordable housing for families in the borough, we need to be very careful that we don't assume that the units that are high off the ground are suitable to supply that need. So we need to make sure that the provision and the need are matched accurately between, and we need to be also cautious that we don't build the slums of the future by building units which are going to be occupied by maybe an aging population who become more isolated because they're too far away from the street and for the amenities around their dwellings. So there are many. I think that some of this detailed analysis has not been drawn out in the document as we see it at the moment and needs further exploration.
But my point about height and tall buildings is because sometimes you get you're in a conservation area and there is no two ways about it. Buildings are not going to go beyond a certain height. So, and that's understood. But then just outside that conservation area, there is a gap and there is a building where people can build up to 26 stories. What I am saying is if we put height limits in certain areas, this way, even areas that they don't fall under conservation areas, they can actually have the benefit of not going beyond a certain height.
Yep. Jonathan, would you like to address that?
Yeah. So the approach in terms of the policy is that I think one thing that might be worth clarifying, the GLA have set a benchmark for when the tall buildings policy will kick in, and that's basically 18 metres or 6 stories. What we've looked at in the borough is the height of the existing townscape and where that policy at that benchmark would be appropriate, and where actually, despite being a historic townscape, you may have buildings that are higher than that. For example, Kensington High Street. So we need to make sure that when we're setting a tall building policy, that we're setting the benchmark in different parts of the borough to the appropriate height, because it would be a nonsense if we were applying a London plan policy at default at 6 stories, if the surrounding context of the townscape, historical though it may be, would be higher than that, because it would make a nonsense of the policy. So I think we just need to clarify that point in the issues and options paper, because I wouldn't want that to be misunderstood, and I think what I've heard, it might be being misunderstood. So that's the first point. The second point is we're not really in a position, I'm afraid, to ban building height at certain zones in the borough. Planning system doesn't work like that, and the government are very clear that we need to have a policy that actually allows particular schemes to be appraised. So yes, we can set a benchmark, we can look at different parts of the borough as to what's low height, what's appropriate, and obviously appraise schemes fully in line with what the context of the adjoining area is. But what you can't do is really have a policy that says, right, in this area, you cannot have a building higher than this amount, this height. Really, the planning system and policies don't work like that. We can indicate which areas may have a policy for tall buildings that might be above the minimum threshold that's set within the London plan, and we can have an elaborate policy, as we do at the moment, talking about context and appraising tall buildings within the context. And I think what I would emphasise is that probably outside the two opportunity areas, there will be I don't think there's any desire to have any more of a flexible approach than there is at the moment in terms of tall buildings. So I think that's probably worth just emphasising. We know the sites where possibly we could have higher buildings. We know that. We know them very well. I don't see that in any way we will be looking for a policy to change that approach.
Maxwell.
Thank you, Chair. After being on the smaller planning application committee and now on the bigger planning committee, if I could wish for one policy, it would be a densification policy in terms of combating that, because it's the one sort of arsenal in the toolkit I've reached for, and after prodding officers, it doesn't seem to exist. And that's why I find myself, in an awkward position where you're forced to potentially prove something when really, if there was a policy that addressed that, particularly on sites, brownfield sites, where a dense building that's kind of starting to overlap the pavement, it's in volume, it's larger, seems more inappropriate. Where it's a new build area like the Kensal, etc., maybe that might not be, that type of policy might not suit. But in already built up areas, I think that's the one sort of wish list policy I wish we could have. So in terms of how a maximum volume as they get outwards, because we've got to think about how wide the area is supposed to, because obviously you've got D9 for height, but on density that's something I'd be very keen to have.
Thank you. Anybody else? Max, Dr. Max, you haven't said anything?
Thank you, Chair. I was going to pick up on the same point about densification. We're constrained by the floor space and we're constrained by the kind of non-negotiable target of 448. So it's a tricky balance, isn't it? So I was just going to pick up on that. It is a tricky balance.
So but in essence what you're saying is you're emphasising the point that was made by the Kensington Society, particularly about the fact that are you saying that you think that this overall document is driven too much by the housing need and the numbers that are, in other words, is numbers of housing units driven?
Yes, in particular the 448 units per year that is non-negotiable.
Yeah.
It's just, sorry? Yeah, I'm agreeing. Yeah, it's not negotiable, and so
the bizarre thing is that if you go back in history, that housing measurement in terms of units was done sometimes in square feet or square meters, and other times in bed spaces, and now it's being done in housing units. So probably the easiest way to go for 448 housing units would be to build studio flats and nothing else.
Can I jump in just on that housing number? One issue I think we also have is that we've got some great sites, the Kensal Gas Works area and the Earls Court Development site, which will deliver thousands of units in one go, and then that's it, to a certain extent. So I guess because this is a year-on-year target, if we can somehow negotiate, can we pad this out over a number of years, please, with how we deliver it, would be far more realistic.
I think there's also some issues to be addressed on.
We do that. There is a 5-year housing land supply test that John can talk more about, but we do have to demonstrate we're able to meet the target iteratively over a 5-year period, and our record on things like completions is measured over a 3-year rolling period as well. So, so we do that.
Yeah, I mean, we have a capacity. I mean, the good thing at the moment, and you may not agree with the London plan target, but it is a capacity-based target. So in other words, they have looked at the capacity. We spent quite a lot of effort going through with the GLA to reduce the target because we walked them through what the capacity realistically was, given all the constraints within the borough. And to their credit, they largely accepted that. I think the concern we might have is if the government decided to produce an objectively assessed need target that was produced through some sort of logarithm, which is not based on borough capacity, but it's just based on some. So hopefully, in fairness, I think the government have recognised that, and there's no indication that they will bring that in. So I think the London plan target we've got, and I don't think, many boroughs have had theirs doubled or even tripled. We've actually had a reduction. So I think we need to bear that in mind. I think the other point I would make is that in terms of densification of sites, we are required, both through government guidance, through London plan guidance, indeed our own guidance, to what we call optimise sites. That's not to maximise sites. There's a deliberate emphasis on optimisation. So what optimisation means is that you're optimising a site, but you're doing the trade-offs there. So you're looking at in terms of the context, you're looking at it in terms of transport accessibility, and you're achieving the optimum development you can on that site. And also creating an environment in which people desire to live. So that is a requirement. We do need to optimise our sites, otherwise we won't meet our targets. But there is a fine balance between densifying sites or overdeveloping them. So that's something that we obviously as planners need to keep a close eye on, as I'm sure you do as members of the committee.
I think one of the things that might be added in there in terms of detail with regards to large sites is that it's a responsibility, as I understand it, of officers to make sure that within a site that all opportunities are being taken to densify without necessarily going high in a way that doesn't meet the demand for the housing that's needed. And a classic example would be if there was a supermarket on a site where the supermarket owner did not want to have housing over the top of supermarket, whereas that is normal practice in many cities around the UK. Because if that big floor plate is taken out of the equation, the only way of countering that and getting the density of housing on the site overall is to make sure that we go for a tower block. Whereas if as a mansion block was put on top of the supermarket, then you wouldn't need a tower block, and it would achieve many more of the objectives that have been identified by committee members here, but also by our visiting societies. So I would hope that officers would use all means to ensure that was addressed in that way.
We have such a small barrier geographically that we have to make sure that every little bit of land within the borough is used in. Yep. We try and optimise. So I hear what you're saying. I think you may be alluding to a particular site, but.
I say on that particular site, I think you make a very important point.
So, Pat,
it's true that the plan is weighted towards housing provision, and of course 448, I think, on the London plan is about half what we originally. I think it was nearly double, or maybe it was more than double. I can't remember, but.
Yeah, 700
was it? It was
733.
But of course, we do have a housing problem. I mean, Kim Taylor-Smith will tell you that we've got 3,200 people on the waiting list, and there's 2,300 people in temporary accommodation, borough residents out there, which, God knows, I mean, it's costing millions. We've seen the figures in the budget, and of course, in terms of building housing, then we've got affordable versus private. Of course, somebody mentioned earlier the model for providing housing in this country. Well, of course, it's a developer profit model. They're not in business to provide affordable housing. They'll tell you it's not worth building affordable housing. They only do it under duress to get something else, to get another bigger, to get their development that will make the money, etc. And of course, we've started a 600 house building program in this borough. The Mayor of London's given, I think, 33 million for the affordable element of that, which is a pinprick in what we actually need. But Michael Black said earlier that, of course, we need to, and the council said they would do this after Grenfell, is to put local people at the heart of everything we plan. This strategy, obviously, we've got a consultation on here, and they can feed into this, but that shouldn't be the end of it. When, after Grenfell happened, the leader and deputy leader in this council stood up endlessly and said that local people would be not just involved in putting their views down on consultations, but that there would be co-planning, that we would not actually impose or plan estate developments or any other type of developments, or presumably put up high tower blocks like in Warrington Green that Catalyst wants to do, the 14-storey block, which people are against there, without their say-so. And of course, in certain circumstances, the Mayor of London will do a ballot if he's given the money, and if people are against it, then it will be out. So we do have a serious housing problem, and just to talk about what Wallace said about tower blocks can have vibrant communities. I mean, the Grenfell Tower had a vibrant community. We know that now because we've seen the oceans of script and the ocean and what they have said about each other. They did have a community, and I have a Dare and Hazelwood Towers and Trellick Tower, 30 stories high in my ward, and believe me, they are quite communities. They involve themselves in the works that's going on. They attend meetings and so on. They were during the COVID years they couldn't, of course. But just because you're living in a tower block doesn't mean to say that you're absolutely cut off. That's some people are, but not everybody. So we are in the most densely populated borough. The North Kensington is one of the most densely populated. And there's only so much you can put into the half-pint glass. It's true, but we do need more housing, and we need more affordable housing. We need housing at rent, as Kim Taylor-Smith will tell you, that people can afford, because he's been told that by the people endlessly, especially in my ward and in North Kensington, who meet with him and officers. I'm sure you've heard this as well, Jonathan, endlessly. So I think we need to put people, we do need to put people, keep people at the heart of all the policies that we are putting in place. And there's a perception out there, because I'm on a lot of different sites and WhatsApp groups where all these different individuals and groups, and there's a perception that the council is sliding back on this. Some of them are virulently opposed to the way the council is now doing consultation across a range of fronts, because they say this is not what they promised us in the beginning. They're beginning to say, here is the plan. What do you think about this? And then, no matter what we say, they say, well, this is the plan that's going into place. I hope that's not true.
Could I invite Councillor Mason to give an example of where the council has presented a plan that residents didn't support in planning policy rather than a specific application? Where we haven't been seen to listen.
Well, I'm not going to give you here right now.
It would just be really useful to know.
I'm talking about consultation.
Can I call the meeting to order, please?
I'm talking about consultation across the piece.
Pat, I think, and Johnny,
Well,
I think it's a useful point that's been made, and I would invite Councillor Mason to write to Johnny, Councillor Thalasites, with an answer to that question. But I think this is not the time to talk about individual planning sites.
Can I just clarify, given that this document ranges right across, it's not just planning, it's air quality, town centres. I can definitely put you in touch with people who Kim Taylor-Smith has met, in fact, who will tell you what they think about the consultation process in their particular arena.
Yep.
The reason I ask is because I think it's incredibly important that the council does continue to listen as much as it can to its communities.
Yeah.
That's still our intention. And it would be really useful to hear feedback of examples where planning policy consultations, as opposed to consultations on other arms of the council, like new homes programme sites.
I'm talking across the piece, not just planning policy.
Okay, well,
a lot of people.
I think the point that we'd all make is that we're not going to separate this out into different departments. This is a local plan. It's planning, yes, and it's in your portfolio, but it is actually meant to be part of a joined-up exercise, the council under the new council plan. So I think this is something that needs to be taken offline, because we're in danger of getting involved in individual sites, and certainly I could quote one where I didn't think the consultation was working very well, but that's for another time. I think that I would like to now ask if there are any further questions. We don't have any, apart from Michael Bark, we don't have any other members of the public here. So could I ask if there are any members of the committee who would like to ask any further questions of the lead member and officer? And if not, I'll try to...
Can I go back to chapter 6?
Yes, quickly.
Okay, quickly. I'll make it very quick. I was just, I think it's 6.25, talking about biodiversity in brownfields. I just want to have some guarantees that wildlife in brownfields, or when we go to develop these, because we will eventually develop our brownfields, we kind of make sure the biodiversity there and the wildlife there have a corner at least.
Well, I certainly think that wherever possible, we should protect and enhance the biodiversity that we do have on these sorts of sites.
Yes, I couldn't possibly finish this meeting without asking about biodiversity.
Of course.
Well, no.
Bees
And can I pay tribute to the
I was
bee
gonna
super
say,
highway on which Councillor Idris is leading?
The queen bee of the council, you know, so
I can't possibly
bee super
be
highway
in an
chief.
environment select committee
But I think
without...
to put another aspect on that, I think it would be, I'd like to attach to that request to officers that we get some feedback on,
And
because
updates.
there is measurement of biodiversity across the borough.
Exactly.
And if there's going to be a development on a particular brownfield site that has some biodiversity content at the moment, we need to make sure that if that biodiversity in some part of that site
Yeah.
is reduced as a result of the development, that the biodiversity of the borough as a whole is enhanced.
Exactly.
That's the
And
trade-off
we
that
can
needs to
have
happen.
if we can have an annual measure of where we are, because we did say we're going to build all these corridors, we have a map, it's going to be an interactive map, all that. We would like to actually have updates in this committee if possible, Chair.
And the key thing there would be some measurement and
Yes.
presentation and some
Yes.
criteria by which things are measured, which are recognised not just in this borough, because bees don't fly just within RBKC, they'll fly to Hammersmith and Westminster and all over the place.
Yeah,
So,
they get around.
Yeah, we are required for biodiversity net gain. So even on an individual site, even if it was being redeveloped, we would expect biodiversity net gain on that site. So
Fantastic.
it may, the biodiversity of the site may change,
Yes.
but the requirement is for a net gain. And that's not just for the borough, that's on an individual site.
Fantastic. Thank you.
okay, now, it's been an impossible task to sum this up, but I'm going to attempt it.
Can I, before we sum up, can I ask a question? Can I return to my questions to the committee? I think it's one of the hardest things with a local plan like this is where to draw emphasis to and which priorities to really make sure are embedded throughout. And necessarily we have to address a wide range of things. And you made the point, or the committee has made the point, that we possibly have too many priorities and aspirations spread across this document. So can I invite you to contribute in terms of, are there priorities or issues that you think we are giving too much emphasis to? Because that would help us have the policy levers to promote the things that we think are most important.
Thank you. I was going to try to address that issue. My first point is that I think that there are sufficient voices from outside this committee and outside today's arena, which have been indicated but have not yet had a full voice to us as a committee. So I think one of the things that we're going to want to do as a committee is to draw further evidence from the community. And we've been invited, for instance, to have a meeting with Boff and his team. We've been invited to go to one or two of the communities across the borough. I think we need to find to be realistic, a way of doing that within the resources we have as a select committee, because we're not trying to second-guess the enormous resources that are inherent within the departments of this borough. But I think we need to hear from one or two of the centres of concern around the borough. So, and also to gain experience from, because we've had the BOF paper, but it's only a summary of the work they've done, and I think it'd be useful to us to have a conversation with them. Now, we also need to try to find out whether there's going to be anything in the short term, because we have a short lifetime as a committee, but whether there's going to be anything in short term with regard to the white paper, because if that's going to be obscure until the end of our corporate year, then that would have to be addressed by a future committee and not this one. But if there's anything to be learnt from, Gove's appointment and his likely direction of travel, which will have an effect, I know it's been adopted, but it will have effect on the interpretation of the London plan and thereby on creating the environment for us. For example, if he was going to level up 200 of the 300,000 houses per annum for national target to go north, London wouldn't have to do the 93,000 that are inherent in the London plan, and that might reduce some of the pressure on us, and we could then reflect some of our local need rather than having just a target imposed on us from outside. So I think we just need to pause on our recommendations until we've taken a bit more in terms of evidence. The Select Committee, I think we basically support the aims of Chapter 6, Greening Blue Future, that enable the local authority to deliver its 2030 and 2040 commitments. And I emphasise the word commitments, because unless there is a different motion before council, that stands and stands above all the decision-making in the senior leadership team or the leadership team. So we as a committee, I think, would regard those as absolutes. If they stay as absolutes, they're going to be very difficult to achieve. Now, one of the ways of achieving it is in a series of steps. The Green Plan very skillfully lays out a pathway rather than an instant requirement. The pathway is fabric first, then the provision of the energy providing sources, low-grade heat for heating, high-grade energy for lights and cooking and so on. And there are ways of providing those which are emerging from the market. And it may be that one of the ways forward is to use that three-stage plan, a third one being the tariff, to take buildings through the stages of their development by the time the target date is achieved, so that you don't necessarily build in the requirement for everything to be done to carbon zero on day one, but if you don't achieve it, you pay a tariff per annum, and maybe that escalates over time as you get nearer to the target time, and the price of heat pumps or whatever comes down. Various industry pundits are saying that heat pumps that cost £10,000 an hour will cost £5,000 within 5 years. If that's the case, if any of you have actually renewed a gas boiler recently, the current standard one, it's about £4,000 to change a relatively small flat's worth of gas boiler now. So if heat pumps to come down to 4,000 or 5,000, and they were developed in a way which were quiet and didn't cause noise and nuisance and so on, to rattling fans that are the bane of many commercial catering establishments, then we could move to a situation where replacing your gas boiler with an electric heat pump or a hydrogen boiler in the future, which is also being looked at. That could be step 2, and in the meantime, step 3 works that you pay a tariff, which pays into the pot to enable people to do that. So I think that there is there's a very good clue in the way forward. I found the Green Plan an extremely well thought through pathway, and maybe we could actually attach some of the policy objectives to that way of thinking as well. So in other words, one would enable future achievement rather than necessarily doing it now. And it means that the graph of how many housing units that Doug Goldring would have to do in the social 7 or 10,000 this year might change, because he might do more on the insulation and less on the boiler achievement of carbon zero, and do more carbon zero boilers later, or heat pumps later, and less insulation later. So, and then around that is the whole question of money, because not only this borough by 2030, this council by 2030, but the borough as a whole are going to have to find resources to do this, and somebody's estimated billions for the whole borough to do it. So how does that get realised? In principle, the Select Committee supports the option of Chapter 7 for achieving the homes, which enable the borough to deliver its housing target, because we have to, unless it's changed by go. However, the implications of the review of the White Paper and the letter from the Chair of the Planning and Regeneration Committee of the London Assembly require further consideration by the lead member. And I think really that those two elements need to be borne in mind as the policy is written, because the world around and the brief given to the options paper may change fairly quickly over time. We suggest the lead member might work more with the community and communities of representatives to facilitate engagement and address concerns about the development of tall buildings in the borough. There is a considerable concern if one walks the streets and talks to people in wards about the fear of tall buildings encroaching, and this is in many wards across the borough, north, middle and south, east and west. So I think there's more work to be done to get across the message that you've put tonight, Johnny, in terms of supporting the proposition of maintaining the low-rise borough. We do have many good examples of very dense developments in terms of our mansion block design, and maybe we could, and they're very popular amongst many of our residents. So maybe we could actually learn more lessons from that way of doing things rather than necessarily going high. I think the Select Committee will need to consider its views in general and other options, the new plan review, submit a response to lead member and officers within the next few weeks. We discussed the possibility of coming up with 10 punchy recommendations tonight, but I think this is too complex a paper to do that. So what I propose is that I work with James Diamond, who's supporting this committee and has given us the structure to talk through tonight, and we develop a series of responses under the headings of these chapters and the priorities we've identified. We'll put it round the committee and we'll discuss further as to what our recommendations will be, but we'll certainly come back to you, Johnny, with a series of balances that we think that need to be restruck, or support for balances that have been struck.
Well, thank you for summing up, Will, and I think that brings us on to the work programme, doesn't it?
Right. Okay, so if we could then move on to the work programme, I'd just like to thank Michael Bach and as he's leaving, for your participation. The report A7, the work programme, discusses the work programme for the municipal year. It is as has been agreed previously, but it's been populated out into an agenda of items across the rest of the year. So unless there are any particular, I don't think any of the content is different from before, but we've now indicated which meeting we'll be having which subject, which hopefully helps officers prepare to attend the meeting. So we have a joint agenda for the way forward for and I think one of the things that we might ask from the lead member, it would be useful in the future, and if James, you could take a note of this, if we could have the lead member provide an outline of his priorities over the rest of this year, that would be extremely useful. It'd be useful to understand your priorities as well as our view of what's going on at the moment, because this is something that I think has been done in other select committees and has proved very fruitful. So thank you very much. Is there any other urgent business? In which case, I'd like to, the one thing I need to draw attention to is that we are, as a committee, going to Lanc West as a visit. So the dates are noted in the papers here, so you make sure you've got it in your diary. I think most committee members have replied. So unless there's anything else, it's, I can't remember exactly, but James, do you know where it's noted? It was in these notes. It's in the...
Chair, I'm not sure of the specific dates in the papers, but it will be a week on Friday, and the invitation's been put in members' calendars.
Yeah. Okay, we'll send around another email to confirm that. Thank you, everybody, for tonight, and thank you for coming.